All right. Let me share my screen here. All right, y'all. So we're gonna be building out a new React application. So I kind of got the starting point up. I ran the npx create React app command in the terminal, as you can see here. And again, the npx create React app command is all it does is just start a new project for us with create React app. It installed the packages, and once it was done, it created a new directory that I could start my project in. So now that I have, after I run that command, I have a new directory. So naturally, what you want to do to get started is just change into that directory, like it tells you there. So I'm gonna do that. And I already started the server. Well, should have already started the server. Let's see. Okay, my bad. So I'll start the server right now, get that popping, and then we should see the browser update with that project. And while that's doing its thing, I'm just gonna make sure that I open the project in VS Code. So let me just close that and open it in VS Code. Some of y'all might be wondering, y'all be seeing me do this code dot command in the terminal often to launch my VS Code folder. That's a really helpful shortcut to just install in your terminal, which you can do via VS Code. I'll show you that real quick because I do think that is pretty helpful. So that basic thing that I'm doing in the terminal is using what's called a command in the terminal to open the folder, right? The dot basically says open this present folder that I'm in. But the code command is a command you can install with VS Code. To do that, all you have to do is go to the VS Code window, and inside of the VS Code window, there's a section called extensions. So you can either navigate there via these icons on the left, or you can use the I think you could go to Go, or where is it? Maybe View. I'm sure you could go to, View Extensions here on the if you click View. But anyway, once you get into actually, I'm sorry. I'm back. Let me back up. In order to install the code command, it's not an extension. It's actually a command you have to run. So what you want to do is to go to View and then go to Command Palette. Sorry. And inside of the command palette, you can type in install code, and you should see a command that kind of pops up like that says install code command in path. And once you click this, it'll install the code command into your local path so that you can use it in your terminal. So that I ran this command already. Once you click it, it runs it. And then you should be able to use the code command in your VS Code in the terminal. So yeah, it's not an extension. It's actually the command palette, which is under View. But yeah, that's an aside. Just wanted to point that out for people who might be curious about where that's coming from. But anyway, now that I got the project open in VS Code, what I want to do is just kind of refresh our kind of perspective on what we've talked about so far, and just talk a little bit more on component, state, and props. So cool, I got the nice React default application running. It says edit the app.js to save and reload to see the changes. So again, just as a refresher, the create React app creates an entire project directory for us. And the most important files inside of the create React app folder with relationship to what we want to change on our websites are going to be in the source directory, the SRC folder. Inside of that, we have this app.js file. And the app.js that we're looking at here is a file that is a component. A component is essentially a JavaScript object that returns some JSX. And JSX is essentially a JavaScript markdown language that, or JavaScript markup language that allows us to essentially create the visual elements that we want to see on our websites, but we can interact with them using JavaScript a lot more easily regular vanilla JavaScript. So JSX is this interesting syntax that looks kind of like HTML, but when you add it into a JavaScript-based file, it knows that you're talking about JSX, which is built into the React library to translate all of this from the JSX syntax and then eventually into the visual elements that we see on our screen. So just quick pause, you know what I'm saying? Show a thumbs if that all makes sense so far. You know what I mean? Just want to kind of get a pulse check. We talked about this several times before, so if you could just drop a thumbs up and let me know if this part makes sense, that'd be great. Cool. Dope. So yeah, you know, these are just kind of vocabulary things we got to get familiar with. Once you kind of keep doing it in the React sense and build that muscle, it'll just be a little bit more second nature. But whenever we're building out components, components are responsible for one thing. Components are responsible for returning some JSX. That's the only thing a component has to do is return some JSX. The JSX can be whatever you want it to be visually, right? This is where, as a front-end developer, you're going to want to think about what kind of elements will I need to put visually on my website. That's the study of what HTML elements might be relevant to use. But then you can use those same HTML elements as JSX because they're built in to the JavaScript in this markup kind of language. The interesting thing about JSX is that we can embed JavaScript directly into these elements. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit as we kind of get into props and stuff like that. But for right now, just wanted to kind of refresh us as to what we're looking at when it comes to components and this app.js component that is the first one. Components are able to receive styling from external CSS files. So when it comes to like your component, its job is to return and render basically the visual components, right? But then you always might wonder like, okay, well, how do I style a component? Well, that's exactly what this app.css file is here for, which basically like a normal CSS file would do. It defines some particular styles and what those styles will correlate to with relationship to different elements in the HTML. And so you can create your visual elements in JSX, and those same visual elements can be styled just by importing the specific CSS file that you want to correlate to the style, to the elements here in this particular file. So for instance, in the regular HTML, right, if we took a look at like a regular HTML file, in a regular HTML file, we would be styling elements based on the HTML file here. Same concept in React or in JSX, right? Based on the elements we have here, we can also target those for styling. The difference is that unlike HTML files where we use the class attribute to specify specific elements, in React and JSX, we use this class name attribute, which is just a slight variation of the same concept. But this is how you can tell this is not HTML because this wouldn't be called class name. It would just be called class. So with these class name attributes, though, you can connect your component to specific styles. So here, this element is clearly going to target something with the class name app. But the React is smart enough to say, okay, well, I'm gonna look for not only HTML elements with the class name app, I'll also look for components that, or I'll look for elements inside of a component that have that class as well, that same class name. So that .app is targeting specifically, in this case, this div and any other div that has, or any other element, I should say, that has this particular class name. So that's how the app.js relates to the app.css, and the styling kind of gets attributed to our component here. So yeah, so we're looking at our first component. In last session, we talked a little bit more about how simple it is to create components. Typically what you'll do if you're starting a new project and you want to make something a little bit more sophisticated, right? Most times we don't actually keep the stuff that's inside of the app.js unless we need to. But this is a template that gave it to us to get us started. So it's common that what you'll end up doing is kind of deleting everything that's inside of here. Until you're, and filling it in with your own elements, right? With your own visual elements. And for that, what we normally do is we create our own components to store visual elements that we want to see. And then we'll pass those components into our app to make the app a little bit more sophisticated to what we really want to do. So basically what I want to do today is kind of just touch on some of that work. And let's just create some more components so we kind of get re-familiar with that process. And maybe what we'll do is talk a little bit about props in the process as well. So when you start creating your own React projects and start building your own components, it's going to be important for you to be organized, right? Just so that you know where all your files are at any point in time and you are able to say, okay, cool. If something goes wrong, I know exactly what file to look at to troubleshoot, right? You wouldn't want to store everything in one file because now that file could just get super long and so complicated to read, and it's not best practice for your for any of your files to just become super hard to understand or read based on what you're attempting to do. So if there's ways that you can separate out concerns and logic, or you can take repetitive actions and turn them into their own function, for instance, those types of behaviors are helpful in the computer programming space so that you can build more optimizable code and more developers can support you with the work that you're doing. So in that case, what we normally do is to stay organized, we typically create a folder underneath the source directory called components to store our components. This is just a common practice that you'll see often is like people creating a components folder. And this components folder starts out empty for now, but once you start populating it with new components, it'll be a big folder of different components that you want to use, right? So let's say I'm gonna work on an application that is going to have maybe some other visual elements that we might want to replace in the app.js. So maybe inside of it, let's say, we're going to create a new file that's going to represent a new component that we're going to create. And essentially that, essentially what we want to have represented here is whatever the component is going to be, right? So in order to create a new component, you just have to give it a name, right? But the name is when you name the file, it's important to also make sure that if you're naming a component, you start it with a capital letter. So in this case, I'm going to make a component, let's call it friend list .js, right? So ending it with the .js lets it know that it's a JavaScript file. As soon as we type that extension, VS Code automatically updates to say, okay, cool, this is JavaScript. And we're just gonna name this component friend list. Another thing that you'll see common in JavaScript is kind of this camel case, right? But in this case, because we started with a capital letter, it kind of just looks like capital letter. And then whenever you encounter a different word, you see another capital letter as well. So that's just typical kind of naming conventions in JavaScript as well. So yeah, so let's just start this friend list component, right? And let's say for right now, all it's gonna be is just a little list of like, of people who I consider my friends, right? Nothing too crazy. But so let's talk about it. How might I want to structure this? Well, there's a couple of different things that I can use, visual elements that can represent a friend or a list in HTML, right? So if you wanted to figure out how to basically at this point, you might be wondering, well, how do I know what visual element I can use to like build out this type of component, right? So for instance, right now, maybe it's like, oh, I want to list data in HTML, right? So you always are going to want to reference the HTML because that's going to allow you to get an understanding of what React element might you want to use in order to make this thing possible. And so there's clearly some different elements that might come up, right? So here you see something like called a data list. But in general, there's there's definitely a couple other HTML tags that can be really helpful as you are trying to build something out like that. So just kind of see if in here they kind of have some of those in here. So list was what I was looking for more specifically. So there's an HTML list. Lists are a very simple HTML element that allow you to structure items in an ordered or unordered format, right? So ordered would be like numerically 1, 2, 3, 4, and unordered would be kind of like bullet points like this, right? So looking at the HTML documentation, you'll see, okay, well, how would I make an HTML list, right? Well, it says any unordered list starts with the UL tag, and then any ordered list starts with the OL tag. And then inside of there, they use the LI tag to mark every list item, right? Any item that's going to be inside of the list. So, okay, naturally, I'll see this. Maybe I'm like, okay, maybe I want to use this unordered list because I don't want my friends to get mad. I don't care about them being ranked. I just want them to kind of show the names, right? So I might use this HTML element. But let's go back to our React project for a second and think about how we're going to start this new component off. So there's the way that we learned right now, and the way that we kind of get introduced to when we first launch a React project is what's called a functional component. And functional components are one type of way that you can define components in React. A functional component is one of the easiest ways to start a new component because it really doesn't require much. All you have to do is use the function keyword with the name of the component and make sure that you return the JSX. The reason that the React team built functional components was to make it very easy for you to just create a new component in a couple of seconds. So let's create this friend list component as a new functional component. So all I'm going to do is write function, use the function keyword. I have to name the component again. So I'm going to name it friend list. Open the parens and the curly braces. So this looks like an actual function, right? And again, like we were talking about, the main responsibility for any component, right, is to return some JSX. So all I'm going to do now is make sure that this function returns some JSX. And JSX, in the case of what we're talking about here, correlates to the visual elements we want to see. So everything that I was just looking at in this HTML is what I want to see visually. So I could almost use this as a reference and bring it in, right? So the unordered list that I want to see, I'm gonna change it up a bit. And instead of having list items that have these beverages, I'm gonna just put some friends. So I'm gonna put my homie Kapara, gotta shout him out. Put my homie Naomi in here, shout her out. And I'll put my homie Alex in here, just to start, right? And cool. And now we kind of have a basic function that is returning some JSX. So we have our first kind of custom component. Now, the only thing that I might want to do next, right, is I want to bring this component into, I want this component to show up, right? And in order to make this component show up, I'm going to need to import it into the app.js because clearly the only visual elements that we're seeing on the screen right now are inside of the app.js. And that's because as a default, Create React App uses this app.js file as the first component to render. I could change it. I could customize it to say, hey, use my friend list component, but it's actually better practice to keep this app.js component as like your main component and just add the new components you want to see into the app.js. So returning it here. So in order to do that, right, I'm going to need to be able to call this friend list inside of my app.js file. So because this is in a different file, I'm going to need to export it and import it into this other file, right? So in JavaScript, you have the ability to create what we call modules that are exportable kind of objects that you can import into another file and call and use just as if their definition was based inside of that other file. So exporting and importing in JavaScript is very simple. So you just at the bottom here, you would say export, use the export keyword, default, and then the name of the object that you're trying to export. So in this case, this file just has one thing inside of it, but I could have multiple functions, but I can choose which of those things are going to be the default one to grab if somebody was importing from this file, right? So I'm going to say export default friend list, and you just want to make sure that you're exporting something with the same name. Otherwise, you'll get an error. So yeah, this is a very simple kind of file, but as things go on and you get more complicated, you might have other functions in here, other objects in here. So this default is really important by saying, basically saying that whenever somebody imports from friendlist.js, the first default thing that they'll get back is this particular function, right? Friend list. If we had something else we wanted to export, we could do that. You can export multiple things from one file as well. So that's why this default keyword is here, to make it basically say that the default thing to get back is the friend list. So cool. We saved this. And then now that this is exported and this custom component is kind of its own thing, I can now bring that into my app.js and modify the app.js to show that component off. So what I'm going to do is at the top, we normally keep all of our imports at the top. So at the top here, I'm just going to import friend list. And the way that imports work is you want to import the name of, basically you import something from something else. In most cases for JavaScript modules. It's a little different with something like a CSS file, but for JavaScript modules and things you want to, like objects you want to use, you need to import X from Y, basically. So the X will be the name of the module that you're going to then use inside of your file. So it makes sense for this name to be relevant to what you want to call underneath here, but it doesn't have to technically be the same name as the name here. But it's just good practice to keep the names consistent so that nobody gets confused reading your code. So I was saying I'm going to import this object called friend list from, and then you got to pass in the path to the file that you're importing from. So clearly friend list is inside of this components folder. And the app.js isn't inside of the components folder, right? The app.js is one level above the components folder. They're both inside of the source folder, but friend list is nested in this components folder. So in order to target the friend list file, I need to say /. So say inside of the source folder, right? / basically says, look inside of this current folder that this file is in. App.js is currently in the source folder. So it says, okay, cool, look in that folder. Then I need to go inside of the components folder, and I'm going to grab inside of the components folder, the friend list file that is saved in there. And so now I have this friend list being imported, but VS Code is really helpful, and it'll gray this out and let you know, hey, you actually are importing and declaring this thing, but you're never really using it, right? Its value is never being read, which means you got this import, but it's not being used anywhere. So that's just helpful to let you know that, hey, the import's there, but it's not being used. And so we got to use it somewhere. So typically what you'll end up doing with your app.js is customizing this to be more relevant to what you want, how you want your application to look and function, right? Because the app.js, just by default from the Create React App library, has a lot of styles already kind of set up and just kind of from that default run. I'm going to keep some of these elements here, like the div and the header, just so that the app has a little bit of style. But everything else in here, the image, the paragraph, and the anchor, which are basically all of the visual elements we see here, I'm going to just delete. So for now, I'm just going to delete those. And instead, I'm going to keep the div and I'm going to keep the header. Just so that I have some styles, but inside of here, I'm gonna call my friend list component, right? And so this is how you call a component. And like basically what we would say when you call a component, typically what we would call that is rendering a component, right? So here I am rendering the friend list component that we just created. And when we can call this process rendering because the app.js component, whenever it returns any of these elements, we know that those elements are then going to be put on the screen. So that process of putting an element on the screen, we call rendering, right? And render is spelled like this, R-E-N-D-E-R, render. So that'll come back in a bit, but essentially here, now we should be able to see our work. So I'm just gonna save this now and wait for the app to reload. And just as a reminder, what we're looking to see is this friend list with the unordered list and some list items popping up inside of the app. And that's exactly what we get here. So again, I kept the div, the app in the header, just so I could have this like, nice little centered text and the background being decent. So I don't really need those. If I deleted those and just had friend list, I'd still see kind of, the point here that this is here. So cool. Pulse check, just want to make sure this makes sense. Creating a custom component and bringing it in using exports and imports into the other file. So if that all makes sense about how we got this custom component in here, just drop a thumbs up real quick so I know that we're on the same page. Nice. Great. Okay, cool. So now that we have this custom component, now that it's rendering and we can see it, clearly we're gonna be able to make as many changes to this as we want. So if I wanted to add more friends to this, I could do that. So now I'll add my homie Perry, and then I'll add one of my other homies, Jordan, right? So cool, I'm adding a nice list of homies. And so as that it gets updated, clearly this is also being updated and we're seeing progress be made on both sides. And cool. So one of the valuable things about React is definitely the fact that when you have your server running, as you save, you can get that nice hot reload feature where you don't have to update the page. It's just gonna save or like re-render everything for you. So that's great. And cool. So what if now, right? Like what if now I want to make this this little list a little bit more sophisticated, right? So right now it's cool. It's kind of cool. I got like this list item with like the name of my friend. But what if I want to kind of add a little bit more information, right? What if I want to, maybe instead of just kind of just their name, maybe I want to add something like, their name, what they like something that they're interested in, and maybe like where they're based right now, right? Like what location they're based in right now. If I wanted to do that, right? Technically, I could find a way to do that just inside of in the friend list, right? So technically, maybe what we would see is instead of just their name, right? Maybe you get their name. Maybe we see something like their name, you know what I mean? We see something like interests, and then, I could say like, mechanical engineering, right? And then something like city, right? And I could say like Chicago for compare, right? And if I save this, right, the way that the UL and list work in HTML, I can really have anything in this list item and it'll still show up, right? So clearly I can put the name, I got the interest, and I got the design, I got the city, right? But if I want to kind of, make this a little bit more robust, maybe instead of it, just because of how it came back just now, I might not want it to all come back on the same line like this. I might want to put some line breaks, right? And line breaks in HTML are really helpful to know because sometimes elements that you use in the visual sense in HTML can come back as what we call inline elements or block elements. Inline elements put everything in one line, right? Kind of like this text is just all in one line, and there's not really a lot of separation here, even though I put some enters in here. So with inline elements, it actually is really helpful to use to break those up, right? And we can use the break tag in HTML to do that. The break tag is really simple. It's just a simple element that allows you to create a line break, right, in any text that you're writing. So the break tag kind of just looks like this, and it just helps you kind of make something that would be all text in one line to be in multiple lines. So maybe instead of this, like kind of working like this, maybe I have the name, and then between the name and the interest, I'll put a break, right? In between the interest and the city, I'll put a break as well, right? And if I save this, now kind of like I got a little bit more well formatted in this sense. You know, I could design this to be more, you know, visually appeasing, you know what I'm saying? But for right now, you get the gist, right? I got this different kind of setup, right? But as you can see, the more that I start editing this list item itself inside of this file, and if you could imagine if I started adding it for all of these folks too, it's kind of getting a little bit, it's getting pretty long, and it's also going to just kind of get a little bit harder to copy, right? I'm going to have to copy this entire list item, and you know, from that, maybe make sure that each of these have the same structure and style, right? So that process of making this one file a little bit more, let's say, like nice to see is going to take a little bit more work. And this is a space where thinking about how can you use custom components to benefit you, this is one of the areas where custom components comes in handy, right? So if you think about a list, right? A list is going to be comprised of different items. There always going to be some item that you're going to have, right? So normally when you create a list in React you're going to end up creating some type of an item to represent the thing that's going to be in the list as well, right? So that might be what I want to do now, is create a component to just kind of represent this list item. And then instead of having these components like kind of these elements just here, I can use that custom component to represent this more complicated list item that I'm trying to build here. So to do that, just like we did before, inside of my components folder, I'm just going to create a new file. I'm just going to call it friend. I mean, you know, I'll call it friend item just to make it make sense. So I got the friend list and I got a friend item, right? Could call it a friend list item if I wanted to be even more specific, but hopefully you get the gist. And the point of the friend item is to be essentially kind of a component that's going to represent this particular item that we see repeated over and over again inside of this list. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take this list item, right? And I'm going to make this new component. So again, to make a custom component, all I got to do quickly, I could use the function component, make a functional component and use the function keyword. So I say function friend item, open the parens, open the curly braces, and then return this JSX, right? So the friend item should be a list item, and the list item should hold some little data points. It should say the name, the interest, and the city, right? Then last thing I want to do is export default friend item, right? Just so that I can call this in another file. So I'm going to save this, and then inside of the friend list, I'm going to import that file into my friend list so I can just make sure that it's working. So I'm going to import friend item from, so now because we're in the components folder, right? Friend list is also in the same folder as friend item. So all I got to do is say // to say, hey, look inside of this current folder, and then it should find friend item right there. So cool. So now that I have the friend item, right? Let's see what happens if I replace this list item with the friend item. So one thing to note is that you want to close these tags in your React components. So like most React components are going to be single line components that close on the same line that they open. And that's unlike other HTML or React elements that you'll see with JSX that open and then close later, right? So this is an example of an element that has an opening tag and a closing tag, right? The closing tag is this syntax here with the slash. You'll see this syntax when you're dealing with something that nests other data. So for instance, we see it with like a div, for instance, right? Where like the div opens and then it closes after it wraps whatever content it wants to see. Same thing with a header in this case as well. But most custom components are going to close on the same line. That's just something to know about the syntax. So now I got this friend item, which is a little bit different in terms of what it looks like here. But technically, we know that what it's really representing is a similar kind of concept as these other list items. So let's just save this and just see if this pops up the same way. And it does. Just to make sure that that's doing that, I could say, I could make this a little bit more specific. I'm gonna say friend item here at the top, so that we know that this is actually coming from there. So cool. So we know that that's coming from there. And great. So technically, I have friend item that represents this list item element, right? That was previously coming back in this list format here. So now, right, like I might want, instead of friend item to be like specifically shouting out my homie Capera, maybe I want this to be like a more flexible component, right? A component that I can use over and over again, because really what I care about with this friend item component is the structure here, right? The structure of this list item with the separate breaks and the name, interest, city, so that I don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to posting, making more friends there, right? So I could totally do this with React. And that's another use case for where components are really helpful is, hey, I got this repetitive kind of thing going on here, and maybe I want to just make one component that will represent this thing. And then instead of having to have these separate elements, I can use one element or one component and maybe change a specific parameter about this component. So it knows, hey, instead of this friend being named Capera, maybe I have another friend item for Naomi and another one for Alex or Perry and Jordan, right? And this is exactly where we can start thinking about the utility of a concept in React called props. So whenever you kind of are building a component out or elements out and you're like thinking to yourself, dang, I wish I could like pass some data into this component so that it can know some stuff about itself and change something inside of it based on something I tell it, right? Something that like maybe I can pass some information into it, right? So instead of this list just sitting here static, it could just say, hey, the list could tell this friend item what it needs to be, 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 what it needs to be. So maybe, for instance, like if I could, instead of having friend item and have a bunch of have these basic things and each one has to be different, or basically instead of having to make like 4 different friend item subcomponents with these same parameters, like instead of having to make a new file and just copy this over and over again, maybe I can just use this same friend item, but just make these parameters a little bit more flexible and pass some data into them. So passing data into a component is very much possible when you use props. So I'm going to say inside of our friend item, I'm going to say we want to pass data into here to customize things a bit, right? That's basically what we want to do. Instead of having this name say Capera, we want this name to maybe be a variable that we can pass into here. And this is where, like we were saying, you can see that these elements are going to get a little bit more sophisticated because we're going to start using some JavaScript to make some things possible. So this idea of passing data into a component is very easy when you use this concept called props. Props are essentially your ability to say, hey, whenever I'm rendering a component, right? Wherever I'm calling a component that I want to render, I have the ability to pass that component some specific data that it can use when it renders inside of its own kind of function or object, right? So in this case, for the friend item, right, maybe some data I want to pass it is a name, right? Maybe each friend needs a name. And so I'm going to say, hey, you know, I'm going to pass it some data. So props are essentially data that you can pass into a component at any point while it's in the rendering, when you're rendering it, right? So the parent component can define the prop inside of the child component. So here I'm going to say, okay, cool. I want to give this component a name. And props are interesting in that we can use them to pass all types of JavaScript objects. And JavaScript objects just are the essential element that all variables and things are built off of in JavaScript. So strings, numbers, Booleans, arrays, functions, everything comes off of the JavaScript object. You could think of the JavaScript object as like the default, the blueprint for all of those other things. And so when we are creating props, we can pass JavaScript objects into the component as data, right? So here I'm gonna pass in the type of data that I want to pass here is a string, clearly. So what I'll say is I'll pass the string Capera, right? And I'll use name as the name of the prop. So essentially now with the way that this is written, I can say, cool, friend item is going to receive some props. So I say this component will receive some props, just so you keep the vocabulary in mind. So this component is going to receive some props. So because this component is going to receive some props, functional components, whenever you want them to receive props, what you need to do is, and this is just a syntax thing, whenever you want this component to know that it's going to be using props, you have to pass the word props into the parentheses here as kind of a keyword. It doesn't mean anything. It's not as though it's not like a regular function where this gets defined somewhere else. This props is a keyword in React, so it knows that what you're talking about with this are the types of data that you're passing here. So clearly I named one of these props name. So that means that when this component is rendering, I can take a look at all of the props that get passed alongside of it, right? So I'm just gonna console log that so that we can just see that in the console and make sure that that's working the right way. So I'll just go to the console and cool. So we got this object and we can see that friend item is passing back this object when the object that we're passing back is this one, props, that we're console logging here. And inside of that object, there's a key called name and it has the value Capera for my homie right there. So dope. So that means that now I don't have to use this hard-coded string here for this list item. I could actually pass some JavaScript into these elements. And in order to pass JavaScript inside of elements, like when they're when they're really being rendered in the return, you can use another set of curly braces to say, hey, I'm going to pass some JavaScript, a JavaScript expression or a variable or something, an object here. So what I'm going to pass, instead of passing the hard-coded name, I'm going to pass props.name, right? And so this is going to allow this name to get populated from what we saw here, right? So Capera's name should pop back up. And cool, and we kind of see that here, name is set to Capera. So now that we have this friend item and we could just pass a name, instead of having to define out all these list items separately, I can just turn these into friend items, right? And kind of model the same structure around that. So change this to be a friend item and change these also to be friend items. Sorry, just trying to use some shortcuts to make my life easier. Right. Cool. Right. And so now we have all of these friend items with the name specified. So they're the same component. The difference is we're passing in a different name instead of something else. So now, as I do that, right, I get this more sophisticated. Let me close this. I get this more sophisticated list, but clearly there's still some things in here that are hard coded, right? Not everybody's going to have the same interest or city as Capera does. So just like I did before, I don't want to have these values be hard coded. I want those values to be coming back also from the specific component that's rendering it. So, you know, Capera has a unique name and has a unique set of interests and a unique set of, and it's from a specific place. So what I might want to do is specify that inside this as props as well. So I might want to create some more props. And creating props is as simple as just saying, hey, I'm going to add some more data points here. So clearly we have name. I'm going to make one called interest. And that maybe I will put for now as just another string. And then I'll put city. And city, again, is just another string as well. So for Capera, he's from Chicago. I'll leave interest blank for now. Naomi, she is in New York. My bad. City. So I'll just add the city real quick. My homie Alex, he also is in Chicago. Perry, I just realized, y'all realize I'm mad biased because all my homies are in Chicago. Perry's in Chicago, and but Jordan is not in Chicago. She's in Atlanta. So I'll put her city equals Atlanta, if I can spell it right. All right, cool. So this is actually kind of interesting. So now I've given all of these kind of components another prop. So they have two props: name, city. Some of them have three. This first one has three. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the city to be related to what we just did again. So if this all makes sense, you're probably saying, okay, cool. If we did it the first time and we put a name prop and we got that name back, it probably makes sense that I can use the same system to get the city back, right? So I'm going to just put props.city. And yeah, there's no tricks to this. That's exactly what you need to do. So this is props.city. And then interest, I'm going to put props.interest. And let's take a look at let's just kind of see something here. So one of these components has interest defined. This one doesn't have any interest. This one doesn't have any interest. These other ones don't have any interest defined. So put in the chat, I want you to say, is this going to work? Yes or no? Like, do you think this is going to throw an error? Yes or no? Put it in the chat. Like, you think if I ran this, if I save this, is this everything's gonna work out, or you think there's gonna be an error? Drop in the chat what you think real quick. Dang, we got one brave person. Y'all really doing me like that? And I'm out here trying to make React cool and stuff. Thank you. Thanks, 3 people. I appreciate y'all. Y'all the real ones. Y'all the real MVPs out here. So yeah, so I'm gonna save the friend item drawn, right? So we got the props kind of defined here. And the question is really about if I have a component that is expecting a prop, right? So clearly this component friend item is expecting props.interest right here to show up. But on these components, I never really specified props.interest. So the question is, do you think this is going to work when I save this? So I'm just going to run it, right? And cool, it's working, right? So interestingly enough, when it comes to components, props are optional. You can pass props into a component. Now, here's the caveat. Most times, if React is looking at something and you're expecting a prop to get passed and it doesn't exist, in this kind of setting and scenario, it's gonna just say, hey, I don't see this, so I'm just gonna return nothing and nothing's gonna show up, right? But if your code starts to be reliant on this thing more, so like say like this particular prop is like in a Boolean statement or something, like in a conditional or something like that, right? There are times where this might throw an error because of the fact that you're relying on this thing being here. In this case where, hey, you're just saying, hey, if, you know, print it essentially, and say, hey, I don't got it, so I'm not gonna print anything. So React doesn't necessarily throw you an error if you're having some mistakes with regard to your props. So cool. So what we're seeing here is we have the different names popping up with the different cities. Clearly, every city is a little different. This is a little hard to read, admittedly. So what I'm gonna do actually is inside of this, I'm just gonna add another break tag just so that there's a little bit more. Well, no, I guess I gotta add it in here, which defeats the purpose of what I really want to do. But yeah, I'll style it myself later. But essentially, you get the idea. We have these various list items, right? And each list item has the name of a friend, interest, and the city, right? If the interest prop wasn't defined, it's still kind of empty. For Capera, the prop was defined, but I didn't put anything. So if I kind of just put something in here and I say, go back to saying mechanical engineering / design, and save that, that's going to populate here as well. So each list item kind of has its own little vibe of data that I can pass into it using props. And so props are really cool, right? Because rather than have to create a bunch of different really complicated looking components, like as complicated as this might look, I could just define it once, right? And in defining it once, I'm able to make this file a little bit easier for myself. And if you think about it, it's a little bit easier to kind of understand what's going on in here too, right? We have this friend list component and it's returning. Clearly this is a list. So even if you didn't know what the UL element was doing, you might assume, okay, this is just probably a list of different items that are going to show up, and right. And then you go and check out the items and you're like, each item is going to be, have some text associated with it. And they're expecting some data that we can pass into them so that we can reuse this component. So props in this case made this component reusable, which is really helpful because now whenever I want to add a new friend with that same style and structure, I can just add a friend item and it's going to show up the right way. So that's one of the things that makes props really helpful is you can pass data into the component and the data can be different in each iteration. And you can use props like a JavaScript variable to kind of just to interact with. So in this case, we're just printing stuff, but you know, in a different case, maybe I want to say, maybe I want to do something specific for like, hey, if someone's city is Chicago, like, you know, we can style this component a little differently. And that's all very much possible because we have access to this variable and we can then use JavaScript to say do some conditional work to kind of test the values of those different things. So cool. Does this concept of props make sense to y'all? Just drop a thumbs up if so, like the idea of passing the data into different components. Nice. Appreciate y'all. All right, cool. So yeah, we talked about custom components. We talked about props a little bit more. So now I wanna kind of level set and introduce us to another type of component that you're going to come up with, you're going to see often when it comes to using React, especially depending on who's writing the React, whether they are, you know, newer in it or older in it. If the code is older, right, you're going to come up with this, you're going to see this other type of component pretty often. And that component is called a class-based component. So right now, all we've been working with are functional components, right? So components that are structured like a function with the function keyword and the name of the component, right? This is like the lightweight way to like define a component, because all you really get out the box with a functional component is just the ability to return the JSX, which, like I mentioned before, that is the main responsibility for a component, is to return the JSX, right? But there's other types. There's one other type of way to define a component. I'm sorry, something fell and it tripped me out. There's one other way to define a component outside of the functional, the function syntax, and that way is called a class-based component, right? So class-based components are essentially components that will similarly return JSX like all of these do, but they're just structured a little bit differently in terms of their syntax. So I'm gonna just take an example, and like we're gonna just convert this friend list into a class-based component, just so y'all can see kind of the differences in a function versus a class, and how they kind of, it's not super more complicated, but the syntax is a little bit different. So when you're working with a class-based component, right, say like this function component, and then after we do this example of turning this into one, we'll just make a new class-based one to kind of just see that from on its own. So if I wanted to convert this functional component into a class-based component, all I would have to do, first thing I have to do is I have to add one import line to the top of the file. I'm going to say import React from React. And this is essentially saying, hey, you know how when we first installed React on our machines, when we first used npx create React app, we had to install, we saw that one of the things, I think I should still have it, or no, I don't, because I started the server. But one of the lines when you start the npx create React app is, hey, installing the React library, right? And we know we installed the React library because in the package.json, we see that React library there. So importing React from the React library is basically saying import the object that this library exports called React, and we're going to use this as this object real quick to like use this particular data piece that comes inside of it. The first line of every class-based component is class and then the name of the component, right? So I'm gonna get rid of this functional thing and I'm gonna say class friend list, right? Because this isn't a function anymore, I can get rid of these parentheses. And I'm gonna say class friend list, and then I'm gonna say extends react.component. So this is the first line of every class-based component. Class, the name of the component, extends react.component. And then inside of the class, what we replace inside of here is we create what's called a render function. And the render function is responsible for returning the actual JSX. This is the only difference. So rather than as a functional component where we can just pass this, we can just return, right? So if I look back at the friend item, right? Functional components, really quick, we make the function name and we return to JSX. Class-based components have an extra function called render, and that render function is what actually returns the JSX. And so with this syntax change, so now I got class friend list extends react.component. I made a render function that returns the JSX. And now that that's done, I can export it. And just like before, everything's going to work out the way that we expect it to, right? So the the whole app still renders the right way. Nothing really changes, but the difference is that we have this this different syntax for how we defined our component. So class-based components have a lot of more complexity to them out of the box, unlike functional components. Functional components, you have to import a couple more things to make them, give them all of the tools that you can just get out of the box with a class-based component. So sometimes you'll see people start their components as classes because they want to give them a little bit more sophistication out of the box and some access to some other things out of the box. So, you know, that was an interesting kind of flip on the friend list component. So let's just create a new class component from scratch so that y'all can see what that kind of looks like. So let me see, basically, let's say, let's call this I'd be like trying to come up with names on the spot, and that's like my worst. That's like my toxic trait is not being able to come up with names on the spot. So let's just say friend list, or let's say friend container.js. So basically, I'm just gonna call this, let's say I make a new component and it's gonna be called friend container or something, all right? If I wanna make this component be a class-based component from the start, this is what I would do. First, I'm gonna import React from React. Boom, step one is complete. Next, I'm gonna say class, and I'm gonna give it a name, friend container, extends react.component, right? And then inside of the class, I'm gonna just create a render function. And that render function is going to return some JSX, right? Because every component returns some JSX, like I was saying before. So clearly here in this return statement, I can have this component return whatever. So in this case, I'll just have it return a simple div, and I'm gonna say, put some text in there for now, friend container. And at the bottom, I can export default friend container. And that's it, little class-based component. Technically, it's not that much more lines of code, but you can see kind of in the difference of like, oh, you know, instead of having, you don't have to import anything when you do a function, but with the class, you have to import something. You have this little kind of more funky line of like extends react.component, which essentially what this is saying is, hey, I'm gonna create a class off of the default React component class. And so there is a class for React components that was created. This was, so class-based components were how people were originally building their components before we got the ability to do functional components. The React component class is what gives this component the ability to have its own render method, and then also get access to a couple other functions programmatically that you can use to also interact with this component as it's being created and stuff. The render function is just the function responsible for rendering something on the screen. So clearly this is where we would return what we want to see, the JSX that we want to see. But now with this class-based component and just like the functional components, we can also, you know, use props and pass JavaScript very specifically in unique ways. Now, let's say, for instance, just to kind of make this point home so y'all kind of get familiar with the class-based syntax and just some of the other differences. Let's say now, instead of this friend list that we had before, I'm going to import friend container from components components friend container, right? And I'm just gonna bring the friend container into the app, right? So now it should kind of swap to just kind of say friend container, cool. And you know, like we saw before, it was very easy to pass props to a component. So maybe I want to swap the message that shows up inside of that component right now, right? And maybe I want to say, hey, or just like, let's just do hello world for now, right? Yeah. So if I want to give this component some props, right, I can do that with just passing the prop, just like we talked about. Now I have a prop called message created, and it has hello world as text. The difference now is that inside of our friend container, right, how do we call props? Because before with functions, it was easy to call props in a sense. We just passed the props into this function kind of name, like, right? Like, and say, hey, you know, this function is going to have props. But clearly with like a class-based component, there is no real space to do that, right? So how do you call props in a class? Well, the good news is props are built into classes. And so you don't need to like call them like in a unique, and you don't have to like say, hey, I want to use props with classes. It already lets you do it. But the difference is how you call them, right? So in class-based components, instead of just calling things like props dot whatever, we actually have to refer to, so let's say I want to change this message to what the message was in props, right? In order to reference the props for this class, I have to use a specific keyword for classes, which is the this keyword. It's a very, very hard keyword to say because people think, what keyword are you talking about? This keyword. Which keyword? This one right here, this. So this keyword is a keyword in JavaScript that basically specifies what that the particular instance of the class is the one that's gonna that we're referring to, right? So this dot props is how I would reference the props inside of this class. And we know that props in this case, I created this component to use a prop called message, right? So inside of the friend container in this class, I can use this.props.message, and that should change this component message to say something else. Simple enough. This keyword is a little bit confusing in JavaScript. I'm not gonna hold you. It's definitely one of those tricky things, and you know, there's always room to make some mistakes when it comes to like, okay, hey, you know, in functions, you don't use this at all. That's one of the reasons why people like functional components. But class-based components also, where they kind of get a little bit more confusing, they also have certain things about them that make them, I think, much easier to understand in certain respects as well. But the biggest differences that we see here with classes are one, you know, classes have to import React, right? Let's say one. Two, classes have more in-depth declaration, right? Because we got to use the class keyword and extends this React.component, right? So that kind of could get a little confusing. Three, classes use a render method to return JSX. And then like, I guess you can say, I think you could say for classes use this keyword to reference things like props and functions. So these are the four differences I would say between like class-based components, just off glance, right? There's a couple other big differences between them, but classes have to import React. Functional components don't have to do that, right? They're a little bit more easy to just create. Classes have a more in-depth declaration, right? You have to kind of extend React.component, right? Functional components, you just call the function, right? classes use a render method to return JSX, right? You have to call this render function and return JSX. Functional components, you just return JSX, right? And then when you are trying to reference things like props or like functions or state, when we'll talk about state in a bit, in order to do that in a class, you have to preface it with the this keyword, because essentially what the this keyword is referencing is like, okay, hey, you might have one class that has different instances up at one time. So the this keyword lets the class know, hey, I'm looking at the particular instance I am. So just like how in our friend list, we have like 5 friend items, right? If these were classes, if this was a class, right? Technically you could say that there'd be 5 instances of the class. This is a function, so just bear with me for the example. In the class-based sense, this might be 5 instances of a class, right? This keyword lets each of those instances know, hey, I'm looking at my particular instance. I'm looking at myself. So this is me in that context, in the class-based context. So it's saying like, hey, look at the particular object instance of that I am, and not the entire class, if that makes sense. So that part does get a little tricky, a little bit to understand, but outside of those things, right? Classes don't look too crazy as like it relates to like React objects, but they're just an important thing to know and to know exist, right? And they're not doing anything more sophisticated than what we've already talked about, right? They're all just kind of they're placeholder object for some JSX, and we can call this placeholder object in lieu of those elements by importing them into other components. And so sometimes you'll be looking at projects and the components that people are using are class-based, right? And you just got to know that the syntax is like this in classes, and that when you're calling objects inside of a class, you might need to use the this keyword. But sometimes people might use functional components, right? And if they're using functional components, you just got to know, hey, okay, this is a functional component, and there's a couple little differences with like how you call props and things like that in a functional component. So right now you might be wondering like, okay, well, why did you bring up classes, right? It's kind of a little confusing. And we're still getting used to functions. And the point is, it's just because you need to know that both of them exist, right? And I'm oscillating between whether I just teach this entire class using functional components, which end up teaching another level of complexity when it comes to the React world. But I think it's also very important if you're going to be coding in React to know that classes also are a thing and exist. And so I guess periodically I might show you the class-based implementation of something and the function-based implementation of something, just so that you kind of are familiar with them, especially because if you start looking at like if you were to go to the regular React.js docs and start looking at those main concepts, like I told you, because most of what I'd like to talk about when it comes to introducing people to React are inside of the docs, these main concepts, right? So a lot of what we talked about in these last couple of sessions are components and props, right? And so if you start reading through this, they're going to show you classes and functions, and you're going to be like, okay, well, what's the difference, right? And so now you kind of can see them. But also, if you start going into like the next unit, which we're going to talk about on Thursday, which is state, well, this might get a little bit more confusing when they start talking about, using a class, and the class is going to use state and all this stuff, right? Versus in the beta React docs, they don't even bring up classes as much, and they just kind of teach you the functional components. And so, I think everyone's trying to figure out what's the easiest way to teach people React, but everybody kind of learns at one point that you could use both, right? And when it comes to how you structure your components, it kind of depends on what all you're trying to get out of it. Classes have specific things about them that make them favorable to functional components is just a matter of like developer preference and also just about like what you're trying to accomplish in the file. But yeah, so just quick show of thumbs real quick, just pulse check. Does that make sense? Kind of this difference between classes and functional components. The little syntax change and structure. Hopefully you can, go back through the vid and like look through this and see kind of some of these differences and just be aware of that they're there. All right, thanks for the love. I appreciate y'all. All right, cool. So in these last few minutes, I just want to say that where we're going next, right? So now with this knowledge, right, you should be able to start creating some visual components to represent things on a particular site, right? If you wanted a pretty interesting site to try to clone right now, a good idea would be to like think about simple HTML like elements that you might want to show up and structuring a site to do something similar, right? So for instance, I'll just show you this real quick because it's I like to use this because it's a very simple site, right? Think about something like this, right? And think about how you might break this into different components and how you might present this on a screen, right? All this really is in HTML. I could show you the HTML. View page source, right? This is just really a heading H1, some image, and a couple links, anchor tags, right? So think about like maybe trying to build something like this for yourself. You can use a lot of the React boilerplate code to do this, but try to make it into your own component, right? And now you can have something that you can work on functionally. You could even start trying to play around with styling to get that to be its own thing. But this is a simple enough kind of set of HTML elements that you could visually kind of communicate in your own components and have something show up on the screen readily. That's not necessarily like, oh, like do this in this homework or something. This is just a challenge. If you want to challenge yourself and kind of practice what you've learned so far, think about how you can use some of those components, whether you use a functional component or a class-based component to get something like that up and running. But yeah, so this is the beginning of like me just talking about just going back through like the props and like components, and we talked a little bit about class-based components and some of the differences between class-based components and functional components. We see that both components can use props, which make it so that we can pass data into them, which is really helpful. So in the friend container or in our friend list, when we were passing props, right? So props are really important function to components that allow them to receive data from other components. And now with that knowledge, we can start thinking about more sophisticated little things that we can build. And on next session, we'll talk about another type of data piece that's really important. And we'll start building out a little bit more complicated applications in this upcoming week. So yeah.